Case number 1. Luis Alfredo Garavito. In the late 1990s, investigators across Western Colombia thought they were looking at separate tragedies. A missing boy in Pereira, another near Armenia, a third outside Tunja. Different towns, different families, no obvious connection. Then someone started comparing the cases side by side. The pattern that emerged became the largest serial murder investigation in the country's history. The man behind it was Luis Alfredo Garavito Cubillos, born January 25, 1957, in Genova, in the coffee region of Quindío. He grew up under a violent father and was himself abused as a child. By adulthood, he was drifting between towns, selling religious trinkets and small goods, blending into markets and bus terminals. Witnesses later described him the same way, over and over. Short, slight, glasses, polite, forgettable. Between roughly 1992 and 1999, Garavito traveled through Colombia and into Ecuador, targeting boys generally between 8 and 16. He approached poor and homeless children with food, small amounts of money, or the promise of work, then led them to isolated ground outside town. He kept records. Investigators found a notebook in which he tracked dates and locations alongside numbers, counts that corresponded to his victims. He clipped newspaper stories about the children he had killed. He was caught almost by accident. In April 1999, he was arrested under a false name, Bonifacio Morera Liscano, after attempting to attack a 12-year-old boy. When police matched his fingerprints to that alias, the scale began to surface. Garavito eventually confessed and, in many cases, led authorities to the remains. He was convicted of 142 murders and confessed to more than 190. Some investigators believe the true figure is higher still. He was sentenced to 1,853 years and 9 days in prison. But here is the detail that has frustrated Colombians for a generation. Under the law at the time, the maximum anyone could actually serve was 40 years. As his eligibility for release crept closer, the case became a national political issue. At one point, a sitting president publicly promised the public that Garavito would not walk free. He never did. On October 12, 2023, Garavito died of cancer and other illnesses in a clinic in Valledupar, where he had been imprisoned. He was 66. No ceremony, no reckoning that felt proportional to what he had done. For the families of children who were never found, there was no ending at all. And this is only case number 1. Case number 2. Pedro Alonso Lopez. If the first case is defined by its scale, the second is defined by something colder. Nobody knows where the man is right now. Pedro Alonso Lopez was born October 8, 1948, in the Tolima region of Colombia, the 7th of 13 children. His early life was marked by extreme poverty, abandonment, and abuse, and he spent much of his youth on the streets of Bogotá. The world came to know him as the Monster of the Andes. Through the 1970s, Lopez moved through Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, targeting young, often indigenous girls from poor communities. He lured them away from markets and villages with small gifts or promises, then took them to remote ground and strangled them. He later said he preferred his victims very young and described the killings without visible remorse. What let him operate so long was the absence of the systems we now take for granted. 3 countries, no shared databases, no fast communication between police forces, no DNA matching. Disappearances in poor and indigenous communities drew little official attention. He simply crossed a border and continued. He was finally caught in March 1980 in Ambato, Ecuador, after attempting to abduct a girl in a market and being held by townspeople. In custody, he led investigators to grave sites and ultimately confessed to a staggering number of killings, claiming more than 300 across the 3 countries. Authorities could only firmly establish a fraction of that. He was convicted of at least 110 murders, the figure most often cited in court records, and sentenced to 16 years, the maximum available in Ecuador at the time. Then comes the part that reads like fiction. He served about 14 years and was released in 1994 for good behavior. Deported to Colombia, he was briefly held over another killing, declared insane, and committed to a psychiatric hospital. In 1998, he was declared sane and released on bail, reported at roughly $50. A man linked to the deaths of hundreds of children walked back into the world for the price of a bus fare. The last confirmed sighting was in 1999, when he reportedly appeared at a government office to renew his identity papers. After that, nothing. Interpol issued a notice tied to a possible later killing. It eventually went quiet. If he is alive today, he would be in his late 70s. Most of these stories end with a cell or a grave. This one ends with a question mark. And a question mark, in a case like this, is its own kind of horror. Case number 3, Daniel Camargo Barboza. Some cases are disturbing because of what the killer did. This one is disturbing because of what the system failed to do, twice. Daniel Camargo Barboza was born January 22, 1930, in Anolima, in central Colombia. His childhood was scarred by the early loss of his mother and abuse by a stepmother. By the 1950s, he had a record for theft, and by the 1960s and 70s, he was moving towards something far worse. He was first arrested in Colombia in 1974 in connection with the rape and murder of a young girl and imprisoned on Gorgona Island, a penal colony off the Pacific coast. He should have stayed there. In late 1984, he escaped, and authorities for a time assumed the ocean had killed him. It hadn't. He had made his way to Ecuador. Over roughly the next year and a half, working out of Guayaquil and surrounding provinces, Camargo killed an extraordinary number of young girls, luring them with offers of work or errands before attacking them in isolated areas. He was rearrested in February 1986 after a survivor's account and a suspicious encounter with police, who found blood-stained clothing belonging to his latest victim in his possession, alongside a copy of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. He confessed calmly to 72 murders in Ecuador and guided investigators to remains. Some estimates of his total across both countries run far higher. In 1989, he was convicted and sentenced to 16 years. Again, the Ecuadorian maximum. And here's where the failures collide with something almost cinematic. While imprisoned in Quito, Camargo was held in the same penitentiary as Pedro Lopez, two of the most prolific killers in the hemisphere, under one roof. On November 13th, 1994, Camargo was stabbed to death inside the prison, reportedly by a relative of one of his victims who had ended up incarcerated there. He was 64. He was never going to be stopped by a sentence. In the end, he was stopped by a knife. And the case became a permanent argument about what happens when dangerous men slip through the cracks not once, but repeatedly. Case number 4, Manuel Octavio Bermudez. There is a reason this next man was compared again and again to Garavito. Manuel Octavio Bermudez. Estrada was born October 15, 1961, in Trujillo, Valle del Cauca. Like several others on this list, he was abandoned young and abused as a child, a biography that recurs in these cases without ever excusing what came of it. Through the 1990s and into the early 2000s, in the sugarcane country of Valle del Cauca and near Pereira, boys began to vanish. Bermudez targeted children between roughly 9 and 14. He would lure a boy away, assault and strangle him with a rope, and leave the body hidden among the tall cane fields. That detail gave him his name in the press, El Monstruo de los Cañaduzales, the monster of the cane fields. For years, his crimes were known in the region only as a wave of fear without a face. A single case finally exposed him, and on July 18, 2003, he was captured. In his belongings, investigators found a child's clothing and watch, small undergarments, and a length of rope. During his hearings, he claimed, as Garavito had, that voices told him to kill children. A court in Palmyra convicted him in connection with 34 child murders, though he had personally confessed to a smaller number. He was sentenced to 40 years, later reduced to 25, in exchange for information that helped locate victims, because the law specifically barring sentence reductions for crimes against children did not arrive until 2006. His death in October 2024 was as strange as anything in his life. While being transferred between prisons along the Panamericana Highway in Cauca, the vehicle carrying him was ambushed by armed men in an attack attributed to a guerrilla faction. Bermudez was killed in the gunfire, along with prison guards and another inmate. He was 63. He spent his life hunting the defenseless, and he died as collateral in someone else's war. Colombia's violence, it turned out, had a way of folding even its monsters into its larger one. Case number 5, Freddy Armando Valencia. This case forces an uncomfortable thought that the most invisible man in a city can be the most dangerous one in it. Freddy Armando Valencia Vargas was born in 1982 in Bogota. By the time police found him, he was living in a rough shelter on the eastern hills above the capital, dressed in rags, indistinguishable from any of the thousands of people surviving on the city's streets. To anyone who passed, he was a homeless man scavenging to get by. That invisibility was the whole point. Between roughly 2012 and 2014, women began disappearing in central Bogota. Many of them already living on the margins, struggling with addiction or homelessness, the kind of disappearances that draw no urgent search. Valencia lured them to the slopes of the Montserrat Hill with offers of food, drugs, or shelter, then killed them and buried the bodies on the mountainside, hiding them carefully so the disappearances would never be connected. The press would come to call him El Monstruo de Montserrat, the monster of Montserrat. His crimes surfaced almost by accident. In November 2015, people building shelters on the hillside reported a foul smell. Police came and found a decomposing body buried near where Valencia lived, and he was captured at the scene. He immediately told them it was not the only one. What he confessed was staggering, and this is where confirmed fact and claim have to be kept apart. To prosecutors, Valencia claimed to have killed dozens of women, with reports citing figures as high as around 100, a number that was never substantiated in court. What the courts actually established was far smaller. He was tied to and convicted in connection with the deaths of roughly 8 to 9 women. He also gave investigators a chilling description of returning to the graves of his victims. His sentencing played out across several proceedings. An early conviction drew a short term that was widely criticized as too lenient, given his circumstances of poverty, and was later increased on appeal. In a separate 2017 case, a Bogota court sentenced him to 36 years in prison, the sentence most associated with him today. He is held at La Picota prison in Bogota. The case sits uneasily because of what it exposes about who gets looked for. Valencia chose victims the city had already turned away from and hid among people the city preferred not to see. For years, both the killer and the killed were invisible by the same social reflex. And that reflex is what gave him his time. Case number 6, Christopher Chavez Cuellar. People sometimes imagine serial killers as relics, grainy photographs, decades-old headlines. This case is a reminder that they are not. Christopher Chavez Cuellar, born in 1973 in Puerto Leguizamo, Putumayo, became known by a name that needs no translation: El Desalmado, the soulless. He moved through the departments of Huila, Tolima, and Caquetá. By early 2015, authorities had connected him to a string of killings that, by police estimates, may total around 15 people, including a taxi driver, a woman in Ibagué, and several children. The crimes were not confined to one type of victim or one method, which is part of what made the pattern so hard to read until it was almost too late. He was captured in February 2015. In November of that year, a court sentenced him to 40 years in prison, the Colombian maximum, for the murders of 2 brothers, the Venegas siblings, among the crimes attributed to him. He was sent to Combata, one of the country's highest security prisons. What stays with people about this case is how recent it is. This wasn't a story from a country that didn't yet have forensic labs or shared databases. This happened in the era of cell phones and DNA and rapid communication, and a man still managed to leave a trail of bodies across 3 departments before the pieces were assembled. Modern tools narrow the gaps, they don't close them. And that is a far more sobering thought than any old black and white photo. Cerrentoy. Case number 7, Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre. The most ordinary thing in the world is to climb onto the back of a motorcycle taxi. In parts of Colombia's Caribbean coast, it's how thousands of people get to work every day. That ordinariness is exactly what Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre weaponized. Ramirez operated across the country's north, through municipalities and cities, including Santa Marta, Valledupar, Agua Chica, Barranca Bermeja, and others. He was charismatic and talkative, and he used it. He would hire a mototaxi, choose a young driver, and keep up easy conversation the entire ride toward a quiet spot on the outskirts of town. Then, from the seat behind, he would seize the driver by the throat. Forensic examinations indicated most victims died by suffocation or were tortured. He targeted young men, generally between 19 and 30, deliberately choosing those who were smaller and lighter than himself so they would be easier to overpower. He kept their belongings, wallets, phones, cards, helmets. For a long time, the deaths were misread as scattered robberies of stolen motorcycles rather than the work of one man. When investigators finally connected them, the count attributed to Ramirez reached around 30 killings across the region, though he confessed to far fewer, acknowledging in detail only one after the body was found bound with rope. What makes this case land so hard is the betrayal built into it. A motorcycle taxi is a small, trusting transaction between strangers. You get on, you talk, you arrive. Ramirez turned that everyday trust into a hunting method, and in the regions where he operated, the fear outlived him. For years afterward, people thought twice about a friendly passenger or an unfamiliar fare. The most frightening predators in these stories rarely lurk in dark alleys. They sit in the seat behind you and ask how your day is going. Case number 8, Diego Fernando Ramirez. Some cases unravel because of a clue. This one unraveled because investigators looked at one man's property and started counting the people around him who had vanished. Diego Fernando Ramirez Hernandez worked at a butcher shop in Buga, a town in Valle del Cauca. In 2006 and 2007, people who had dealings with him began disappearing. The press gave him a name that captured the dread of it, the Butcher of Buga. In March 2007, authorities arrested him and searched his estate. Buried in a mass grave more than a meter deep on his own land, they found the bodies of 2 men. He was directly tied to those 2 killings, but investigators came to believe he was responsible for several more, examining at least 6 other disappearances of people who had all had recent contact with him. A pattern emerged from those connections, and it was a cold one. In most cases, large sums of money appeared to be involved. These were not crimes of rage. They were, by the authorities' reading, calculated. People drawn into a transaction with a man who then made them disappear into the ground behind his home. That is the particular horror of this case. There was no dramatic chase, no monster lurking on the edge of town. There was a working butcher in a small Colombian city, conducting what looked like normal business, with a grave in his backyard. The number of victims attributed to Ramirez remains uncertain, confirmed at 2, suspected at more. And that uncertainty is its own unease, because it means the full extent of what happened in Buga may never be known. Case number 9, Diego Ruiz Restrepo. This case crosses a border in the opposite direction from Chambas, a Colombian who carried violence south. Diego Alexander Ruiz Restrepo was born March 14, 1990, in Cali. By 2013, he was living as an undocumented migrant in Santiago, Chile, in a working-class commercial district called Meigs, in the Estación Central area of the city. His victims were among the most invisible people in any city, men living on the street. Between March and November 2020, in the Meigs neighborhood, homeless men were attacked and killed. Because the victims were unhoused, the deaths did not immediately trigger the kind of urgent, coordinated response that other killings might have. That gap, society's habit of looking away from people who have already been pushed to the margins, is a thread that runs through several cases on this list, and it gave Ruiz room to operate. He was confirmed responsible for at least 7 murders, with some accounts placing the suspected total far higher. He was apprehended on November 9, 2020. Chilean courts sentenced him to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole only after 40 years. What this case exposes isn't only one man's cruelty. It's the uncomfortable truth about how predators choose. They search for the people they believe no one will miss quickly. No one will investigate urgently. No one will mourn loudly. When a society treats certain lives as disposable, it doesn't only fail those people. It hands a killer his hunting ground. The marginalization came first. The murders came second. And that order should bother us more than it usually does. Case number 10, John Jairo Moreno Torres. We end not with a sentence served, but with a story that was cut off before the law could finish it. John Jairo Moreno Torres was born in 1979 in Bogota, into a poor and unstable household. He grew up fast and hard in the capital, and by his late teens, he was at the center of a violent criminal circle. The press gave him a grim nickname, Johnny El Leproso, Johnny the Leper. His killings in 1997 and 1998 were brutal and close range. Authorities officially linked him to the deaths of at least 4 people, though investigators believe the real figure was higher, with estimates ranging from roughly 10 to 20. Here, again, the distinction matters. 4 confirmed, the rest suspected and never proven. He operated with accomplices, part of the broader street violence of Bogota in that era. Police tracked him down through an associate and arrested him on February 27, 1998. He was taken to La Modelo, the capital's infamously violent prison, to await trial. He never got one. On June 11, 1998, inside the prison, Moreno Torres was attacked and killed, beaten, stabbed, and shot. He was 19 years old. Accounts of exactly who did it and why vary, as they often do with deaths inside La Modelo. But the outcome was the same. A young man accused of multiple murders died before a court ever ruled on a single one. It is a fittingly unsettling place to end.